if history hid a disaster right beneath your feet? Across the world, from Paris to Chicago, strange clues whisper of catastrophe. Doorways swallowed by earth, windows buried below ground, entire streets layered over forgotten ruins. Some call it bad architecture. Others call it the mud flood, a cataclysm erased from history. Walk through the streets of Europe or America's old cities, and you'll notice something unsettling. Windows buried beneath the ground, doorways leading straight into earth, grand facades sinking into the soil. Historians say it's just engineering quirks, raised streets, basements, shifting foundations. But mud flood believers see something more, proof that, less than 2 centuries ago, a global deluge of mud buried entire civilizations. In the 1850s, Chicago faced a crisis. Heavy rains turned its streets into rivers of sewage, spreading disease. The solution? Raise the city itself. Block by block, streets were lifted nearly 2 meters. Hotels, offices, even a 6-story building were cranked skyward while guests kept dining inside. Imagine sitting at dinner while the floor beneath you slowly rose into the air. To historians, this explains the sunken windows still visible in Chicago. But for mud flood believers, the raising wasn't innovation. It was concealment of a catastrophe already half buried in mud. On the other side of the continent, the story feels eerily familiar. After the Great Fire of 1889, Seattle leaders rebuilt by raising the entire downtown, turning the first floors of buildings into basements. Today, visitors can explore the Seattle Underground. Corridors where dusty windows stare into soil and abandoned storefronts line ghostly streets. To skeptics, it's clever engineering. To believers, it's another buried city, another piece of evidence. For mudflood believers, the story doesn't end with sunken windows and half-buried palaces. They argue these are only fragments of a much bigger puzzle, the erasure of a lost empire known as Tartaria. What is their strongest evidence? First, they point to the architecture. Across the 19th century, cities from Moscow to New York sprouted ornate domes, colossal arches, and endless rows of neoclassical facades. Historians explain this as a revival style, Europe's industrial wealth copying the grandeur of Rome and Greece. But mud flood theorists see something different. Too much magnificence, too quickly, in too many places. To them, this is not imitation, but inheritance. The remnants of Tartaria's world-spanning civilization, buried in mud and mistaken for new construction. Second, they highlight the strange geography of buildings themselves. In St. Petersburg, Paris, or even Istanbul, entire levels of these Tartarian structures sit below the present ground line. For believers, the buried windows and bricked-up doors aren't quirks of engineering. They are scars, silent proof of a sudden engulfing event. Why, they ask? Would builders intentionally construct ornate windows that look directly into soil? To them, the simplest answer is that these buildings were never meant to be underground at all. They were partially submerged in a global mud disaster. Finally, they draw on forgotten cartography. Old world maps label vast swathes of Asia as Tartary, while historians dismiss the term as a loose European label for the unknown East. Mud flood theorists interpret it as a sign of suppression. Tartaria, in their eyes, was a real and mighty empire, erased through both catastrophe and deliberate rewriting of history. The maps, combined with the buried architecture, form the pillars of their case. A civilization once existed, it fell to a flood of mud, and its ruins are what we mistakenly call 19th century neoclassical. Taken together, these elements create more than speculation. They form a narrative. The ornate buildings are reinterpreted as ruins, the buried windows as physical evidence of disaster, and the maps as traces of an empire stricken from memory. In this way, The mud flood theory transforms anomalies into testimony, and coincidence into what they see as undeniable proof. The mud flood theory soon connects to an even larger mystery, Tartaria. Old maps labeled Tartary across Central Asia and Siberia, a vague term to historians, but to believers it was a vast empire, technologically advanced and wiped from memory. They point to the 19th century architecture, domes, arches, columns that rival Rome. Official history calls it neoclassical revival fueled by industry. Mud flood theorists call it the ruins of Tartaria, buried in mud and erased from history. For skeptics, the mud flood theory doesn't stand on solid ground. Historians and engineers argue that the so-called best evidence is far better explained by ordinary processes of city building, soil movement, and human progress. To believers, they are proof of a cataclysm. To architects and city planners, they are simply the result of urban development. Many cities, London, Paris, and Rome among them, were built in layers. Streets were often raised to combat flooding, improve sanitation, or accommodate new infrastructure. What looks like a sunken window today was, in many cases, once a ground-level feature before the street outside was paved over again and again. In short, history shows us streets rise, the buildings stay put. The same is true of erased Tartarian architecture. Historians point out that the explosion of neoclassical domes and colonnades in the 18th and 19th centuries coincided with industrial wealth. To engineers, there's nothing mysterious about the global spread of this style. Railroads, industrial mills, and steel production made it possible to copy the look of antiquity quickly and on a massive scale. What believers see as too advanced for the time is, in fact, the visible signature of a world in the throes of industrial revolution. Even the maps of Tartary, a favorite piece of evidence for believers, are less compelling under scrutiny. It was never a defined empire, and its disappearance from later maps represents not a cover-up, but a refinement of knowledge as exploration filled in the details of Central Asia. Geology too works against the mud flood claim. Natural disasters of the scale believers propose, a global surge of mud burying, entire civilizations, would leave unmistakable layers of sediment in the Earth's record, visible to archaeologists and geologists alike. Yet no such layer exists. What we do find are local floods, landslides, and dam bursts, which certainly buried towns but never on a global scale. This is the weight of mainstream evidence. Buried windows explained by rising streets, ornate architecture tied to industrial revival, maps clarified through exploration, and geology showing no trace of a worldwide catastrophe. Against such explanations, the mud flood fades into the realm of myth, and yet the photographs still remain, enigmatic enough to keep the mystery alive, even as historians insist the answer is far more ordinary.